Good day, everyone. My name is Harry. I'm the moderator for this webinar on the behalf of the organizer company called Conference Panel. I welcome everyone for today's webinar, which is called Joint Commission Hot Topics 2021 Advanced Directive Contracts and Grievances Informed Consent. So I would like to now present our presenter for today, Laura A. Dixon. She is my favorite speaker. So Laura A. Dixon served as the Director of Facility Patient Safety and Risk Management and Operations for QAPI from 2014 to 2020, where she provided safety and risk management consultation and training to facilities practitioners and staff in multiple states. Ms. Dixon has more than 20 years of clinical experience in acute care facilities, including critical care, coronary care, perioperative services, and pain management. So now over to you, Laura.
Great. Thank you very much, Harry, for that very nice introduction. And I want to welcome everyone who's listening in to today's program. One of the things that has stayed pretty static, with the exception of one or two items, is Joint Commission. And I'm going to say Joint Commission and also CMS, because they have really stayed quite consistent in their standards and their expectations for healthcare providers. They do recognize you are under a great deal of stress and pressure, and that there is going to be some times when you don't meet what they hope you do, but they are recognizing the conditions that you are working under. What are we talking about today? Well, of course, Joint Commission. And essentially, there's two sections in the manual that talk about the issue of informed consent. Now, in the conditions of participation with CMS, they're in 3 or 4 different sections. We're talking about what Joint Commission has. We're also going to talk about Joint Commission requirement that hospitals have a policy on informed consent. That's no different than what CMS requires. We're going to talk about Joint Commission's contract management standard, and that really hospitals, they need to evaluate every contract, not just those that involve direct patient care, specifically those in particular, of course, but every contract. Joint Commission does require hospitals to provide patients with written information on a mission regarding advanced directive. It's not something we like to talk about, but we still have to provide it to them. And also that Joint Commission does state that patients and families have the right to file a complaint or grievance, and that they need to be reviewed and responded to and resolved, hopefully, in a timely manner. And finally, that Joint Commission does have some changes to the standards, not only in 20, but you're going to see those coming up in 2021 also. Now, I do want to mention that, by the way, it is now Joint Commission, or TJC, is no longer considered JACO. As far as the conditions of participation, Joint Commission is only one of 4 what they call accrediting organizations, or AOs. There are 3 others. And by having these other organizations, Joint Commission, DMV, et cetera, they have what's called deemed status. So if you have a Joint Commission survey and that's deemed status, you don't have to worry about having that CMS state review. As far as real quick, I'm not going to spend too much time on CMS because that's not the focus here. The conditions of participation, that's the manual. That's the playbook for CMS. Those conditions were first published back in '86. They updated, of course, more frequently now. In fact, the last revision was in February of 2020. The regulations all start in the Federal Register. From there, CMS will tell you what they mean through interpretive guidelines. And it's critical that if you do not have Joint Commission, or if you just want to see what CMS says, look at those interpretive guidelines. I'm just giving you some examples of what those manuals look like. This is the most recent one, and that's just what it will look like if you ever open up the manual. That's for hospitals, and that's for critical access hospitals. You do have separate manuals. So let's jump into it and let's get started. I want to start with complaint standards. Joint Commission does have them, and they start at RI, which really stands for Patients' Rights and Responsibility. Joint Commission, by the way, does call them complaints, and CMS calls them grievances. But let's go ahead and start with the first one. So the patient or family has the right to have that complaint reviewed. You have to establish, the hospital, some kind of process to resolve that complaint. The items I've listed here, MS, that's medical staff, LD, that's leadership. And both of those say that the board or governing body is responsible for the effective operation of the complaint resolution process. Again, this is a CMS requirement. Let's switch over real quick to Beneficiary and Family-Centered Care, QIOs. They manage all complaints from the Medicare beneficiaries, whether it's quality of care, EMTALA issues, any complaint they're going to handle. And by the way, they do look at quality of care. And the reason they're doing this is that they want to ensure consistency in that process. The QIO, the organization, helps hospital make aware of the fact, by the way, I have this complaint from this beneficiary on quality of care. Patients can ask that the complaint, they can ask you, in fact, to forward that complaint to the QIO, or they can complain directly to the QIO. So there's two ways that it's going to get up there. What happens if, unfortunately, the patient proceeds to file a lawsuit? Well, then things really take a different focus. All right, let's move on to contract management. We put this in because there's been a lot of different things going back and forth now with contracts, in particular with telemedicine. Joint Commission does have its separate contract standard, and by the way, it's located in leadership. They've been rewriting it 2009, and they keep updating it. Let's do just a quick overview of contract. As far as contract definition, they do give a definition of that contractual agreement, and it's an agreement for services by either a person or a company to be provided to or on behalf of you, the organization. All right, let's turn the page. Let's go over to consent, informed consent. That always raises a couple questions because there are so many factors that go into play in informed consent. By the way, CMS has 3 different sections in their conditions of participation that talk about informed consent. So it's not just one. They can't make it easy for us. There's 3 of them. Your state law may have other rules on informed consent, along with another accrediting organization, including Joint Commission, which of course has a standard on informed consent. And they put it in 2. One is in the Patient Rights Center and one is in the record of care section. So I want to move over to advanced directives. I mentioned this is kind of a conversation we don't like to have all the time, but it's important to have. And honestly, it is also required now. Again, Joint Commission, not JACO, it's a document or documentation that allows the person to give directions about future care or assigning someone else to make those decisions if I can no longer do that. I lose the capacity. All these different types of advanced directives. All right, federal laws. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on some of the federal laws. It's called the Patient Self-Determination Act, or PSDA. Be aware of what's in there on advanced directive, and it's called just that, Patient Self-Determination Act. Include it in your education with your staff on your policy. So it's not just state law, it's also federal laws. And we have to make sure patients get a copy of those rights in writing on advanced directives. Why did we want to do that? Because we want to make sure patients are aware of their rights on decisions regarding their own medical care. Not necessarily the end of life, but during their care in general. All right, I'm going to wrap up with some of the changes. We're done a little early, I have a feeling, but here are just some of the changes. These went into effect of July of last year. Most of them were done to comply with CMS. Now you'll see this is 2020. Now about this time, CMS was having a little discussion with Joint Commission because there was a question and a concern whether or not the actual survey were meeting the standards that CMS would expect. And Joint Commission recognized that, and they did make changes. And so with that, that will bring us to the conclusion. And I want to thank everyone for attending. Stay safe, and thank you for what you do.